Welcome back to another episode of the Educational AD Podcast, brought to you by Violet Defense. Violet Defense is dedicated to protecting our world from germs by bringing the power of UV disinfection to everyday spaces. Their patented technology enables them to harness the power of the sun to incorporate ultraviolet light into products and environments like never before. Whether you're ready to implement existing products, or if you'd like to explore researching and developing a custom deployment of their technology for your school, Violet Defense has the solutions and the experience you need. Thanks again to Violet Defense for sponsoring the Educational AD Podcast. The Educational AD Podcast also wants to thank Varsity Brands, featuring BSN, Varsity Spirit, and Herff Jones. Varsity Brands, elevating student experiences in sport, spirit, and achievement. We also want to thank Hometown Ticketing, who helps thousands of schools across the country seamlessly provide convenient digital ticketing options for their communities, families, and fans. Hometown Ticketing, simple and easy online ticketing. We also want to thank Ephesus Lighting, Gipper, Vital Signs, and Camp Mobile for sponsoring the Educational AD Podcast. Thanks to all of our great sponsors. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Educational AD Podcast. Today, we're visiting with truly an old friend, Deep Sidhu, used to coach for me when we were both at Palmer Trinity down in South Florida. Now she is the Director of Equity and Inclusion, also works in instruction for Global Online Academy out of Raleigh, North Carolina. Deep, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jay. Great to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, we're excited to hear what's going on and the things that you're doing with your new position. So let's jump right into it. We always like to let our listeners have a chance to get to know our guests. So tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school and college, maybe a little sports background, and all those steps that led you to your current position with Global Online Academy.
All right, sure. I'd love to. So I was born and raised in a town in Ohio called Springfield, and went to a public school there until 8th grade before transitioning to a small, like very small independent school in Dayton, Ohio. And my early athletic journey sort of mirrors that of going from community and public school sports participation to an independent school. So I started, I think, in early toddler life with YMCA programs, swimming, gymnastics, soccer, and then as I got older, participating in community and school leagues and teams. So got to participate in a number of team sports. So I added basketball, softball, volleyball to that. When I transitioned to the small independent school, I focused just on softball and spent a lot of the year focusing on pitching as a pitcher, and got to participate in softball throughout high school. And then when I moved to college, I went to Bryn Mawr College, which is a women's college outside of Philadelphia. They didn't have a softball team. So that's actually when my formal participation in athletics ended, but then started sort of this lifelong yearning to continue participating in athletics in some ways. And I think probably transition more towards fitness and trying to ensure that I had creative and fun ways to continue to live a fit and healthy life. But so much of my experience in athletics then did transfer to my experience in teaching. So after graduating from college, I went to grad school at UPenn to both student teach and also earn my certification in teaching. And then I taught in two charter schools in Washington, DC, high school English. And then before moving to Miami, where I met you, Jake, and continued to teach at Palmer Trinity. Following that, I went back to grad school for ed leadership and had this wonderful opportunity to join the team at GOA, at Global Online Academy. They're doing amazing things with Our mission is to reimagine learning to empower students and educators to thrive in a globally networked society. And so I got to join the professional learning team there, working with teachers in schools and just thinking about how we can support schools and teachers and students in learning and in supporting the deeper learning for all kids. So that has been really wonderful. And actually so much of our work is inspired, I think, by elements and aspects of coaching and how we all learn and grow and experience success.
I always love hearing the stories. And again, I knew a little bit of your background because again, did work together, but it's always cool to hear those various steps that, occur in a career. Another question that we always ask our guests has to do with this idea of leadership and particularly mentoring. So my question is, who are some of your mentors? Maybe family members or teachers, coaches that you had growing up, or people that you actually worked with or worked for? The expression I always use is, I still hear those voices in my head when I'm talking to a coach or a kid or sometimes a parent. So whose voice do you still hear?
Yeah, I mean, I feel so fortunate to be in the field of education because both as a student and then as a teacher and educator, I've had the chance to have so many mentors in life, and many come to mind. But I guess what I'll talk about right now is my earliest teachers and earliest mentors, my parents. And one voice in particular that comes to mind daily is that of my dad's, who has encouraged me always to make every encounter a good one. And so I think, especially as somebody who moved literally across to another side of the world at a young age alone, that's a mantra that he's repeated to himself. And so it's been both interesting and inspiring to me to sort of interpret it in my own life, both professionally and personally. And so making every encounter a good one, I think as an educator or as a person, isn't necessarily making everything a superficially pleasant experience, but to remember that we have agency in our lives to try to promote good and work towards good. So it's been hugely helpful to me in my personal and professional relationships, but also in trying to live a life of purpose, I think, to try to remember to make every encounter a good one.
Again, you can't, I think, overstate the influence that our parents have on us, both good and sometimes not so good, but great to hear that how your father's influence has kept going in you. Let's talk real quickly. Again, you're not an athletic director and you're not specifically involved in coaching right now, but I still remember you really doing a great job for us at Palmer Trinity with that middle school cross country program. I would say at the time you came on, and there were some other coaches there too, that the middle school program in particular was kind of on life support. And a couple of years later, it was thriving under your leadership. So maybe share a little bit with our listeners how you approached that task and how you turned it into such a successful middle school athletic program.
Well, thanks. I think I was fortunate to get to participate in the team that worked with the cross country team. I think one thing that was really apparent to me right from the get-go is that these kids have far more skill and talent than I do, and that's kind of helpful to know as a coach, because it's not about necessarily imparting my own knowledge necessarily, which is sometimes the sort of mindset we take in the classroom, which I think needs to change too. But thinking about who each kid is and what they bring and how they're developing and how they're growing. And so I think that was one sort of lens that was sort of helpful in bringing to a sport like cross country, where kids sort of are developing individually, but also as a team. I was also at that time a novice coach. I think I volunteered to help out however I could, and I got the great opportunity to learn from other coaches. And I think at that time, where I was primarily coming from just a teacher role, it was really helpful to to be reminded of coaching practices that maybe feel different, but should also be in the classroom too. And so Palmer Trinity had wonderful coaches who also served as mentors to help out in the logistics of thinking about, well, what does the day-to-day practice look like, starting from the very beginning, and the entry points of what do I need to know, what do I need to be able to plan, but also from there, what does it mean to truly encourage and support an athlete in their development, and even those who are experiencing so much success, how do I continue to push them, and how do I continue to support them? It was all just a wonderful learning experience, I think, for me.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way. All I have are just great memories from those years with you guys on the staff. Let's go and talk a little bit about your current position at Global Online Academy. As we said, you're the Director of Equity and Inclusion, and that's certainly a hot topic these days, as it should be. So what are some of the things that you do for Global? What are some of the things that you plan on doing in the future?
Yeah, so this role is new, although, like you said, it's has been important for way longer than this role has existed. So some of the work that I've been doing has just been to elevate it as a priority in what we do, and to bring intention to all of the hopes that we have in ensuring that we are developing and designing, or sometimes redesigning, systems, structures, practices in the interest of equity and equitable experiences and outcomes for all kids. And so some of that at this point has just been working with schools and educators and thinking about what that means. So how do we design for equity? What does that even mean? And I think it's been there's been polarizing debates surrounding the conversation. I think it's important to distinguish the two. I think the polarization is oftentimes multiple conversations happening at the same time. And what we're talking about is really ensuring that we are focusing on each and every kid and their successes, and ensuring that we are providing equitable experiences and outcomes for them. So one of the ways that we've engaged in that, and I think one of the things that I've recently written about, Jake, and we connected about, is sort of those entry points, and one of those is disrupting neutrality. Just this idea that, and I think this is true on in the playing fields and courts and locker rooms and all of the things, is that we have to bring intention to the environments that we create, the cultures and communities that we're cultivating, to ensure that we're fostering belonging and we're cultivating a culture of belonging for all kids.
I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Yeah, please.
Most of our listeners are athletic directors and coaches, and we hear, these terms, being intentional, serving all kids, all populations. What are a couple of things that you can tell, the athletic director or the coach that's listening right now? What are some things, some techniques that they can do, today, tomorrow, this week, with their kids, or with an athletic director, with their coaching staff, to do a better job in this area? You got some advice?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the 3 steps that I wrote about and apply it a little bit more directly to this audience. The first is, I think we need to all sort of start with ourselves. And what that means is just a sort of recognition and reminder that who we are influences and informs what we do. And so who we are is comprised of so many things. Sometimes it's our identities, it's where we grew up, it's how we grew up, how we've experienced life around us. And that has informed our lenses and our perspectives. And ultimately what that can result in is that we have points of focus and we have points that are in our margins. And we want to do a better job of ensuring that we are aware of the margins of our lenses. And so an example of that might be that I, for example, have rarely, if ever, had to consider on a daily basis, especially what it's like to have a family member who is actively serving in the military. And because of that, and I've got friends and siblings of friends who have served, and so I've got some, sort of peripheral understanding or awareness or sympathy, but I've not experienced it myself, so I don't know what that feels like on a day-to-day. I have, on the other hand, have had experiences where I've had to worry for friends and family members who have been the victims of hate crimes as a result of what they look like. So some of them, have brown skin and have beards, and some wear turbans, and they've experienced verbal harassment or physical violence based on what they look like. And so that's one experience I've had. That's another experience I've not had. And these aren't always deficit based, of course. These are identities or experiences that we've had that give us points of connection and community to, our being a child of immigrants, for example, connects me with others who are children of immigrants in some ways, some natural ways. But because of that, as an educator, as a coach, there are going to be kids and students and players who show up who are living a different lived experience. And that's always going to be true. Sometimes these identifiers and experiences aren't as physically apparent, of course, but we all have different lived experiences. And sometimes starting with self is just this reminder that, hey, there are things that I'm not thinking about. There are experiences these kids are having that I'm not aware of. And being intentional about expanding our lenses, expanding our perspectives, so that we're not accidentally neglecting some or erasing some experiences and identities for kids. So I think that's one sort of first tangible step is to just have that reflective moment and reminder to ourselves. The second that I've written about, and we've talked about, is to prepare for the ongoing. And so the concept of team building here, I think, is pretty relevant, especially for this audience, because we've all experienced or know that icebreakers or motivational speeches aren't just one-time things that will dramatically and forever change, the culture of our teams. But it's ongoing work and it requires intention. And so I think on teams, or I think one way that coaches do this really well is that every year or every season, you have a new roster, and you're paying attention to each kid and what they're bringing, and not just the skills that are going to be a part of the team, but how the team will function well. What are the ages? Who are the players, and how will they get to work well together? And so it's really intentional work that coaches do. And I think that's sort of the same when you're thinking about how to be a more equitable practitioner, is thinking about, well, what are some of the ways in which some kids are joining the team and there are structures and systems that haven't been designed to support them, and what can we do to mitigate those and ensure that there's a little bit more of an equitable entry point. And so in sports, as we know, there's been barriers to entry for participation. There's been outdated uniform restrictions, so many things that sometimes they're one-off fixes and sometimes they're ongoing efforts. And so I think that's another kind of point to remember, is that it can be ongoing. And a quick example I'll share of that is when my brother was playing sports in Ohio, he used to wear a patka, which is a head covering, a religious head covering. And during certain games, the ref would say, oh, you can't play because of that. And so over time, we had to get, sort of the permission from the state that this is actually allowed. It's a religious accommodation, it's First Amendment protected, so on and so forth. And then it took years for that to sort of become a national change and something that kids don't have to experience as much anymore. So sometimes those ongoing, the reminder that this work isn't always just a one-off, it's ongoing, can be helpful. And then I can talk about the third and final one, which is to prioritize impact. And I think this is mostly that reminder or permission grant or giving to ourselves. Sometimes I think when the goal is to eradicate all inequities or to change the world for good, that can be really overwhelming. it can cause us to want to give up or wait for everything to be figured out before we even get started. And I think sometimes that's the pressure of the moment, in wanting to make sure that we do everything perfectly. But I think a reminder again that we're doing this for our kids and for each kid, and we make this who we are and what we do regularly, then we are maximizing the impact that we can have. So I think ultimately, like for the example of belonging, when a kid shows up to practice on the first day, we've all had the experience of showing up, entering or engaging with an environment where we either feel like we really belong or we feel like we don't belong. And those cues that have triggered that for us can be subtle or overt. And I think for us, for coaches, for athletic directors, we're just thinking about what are the things that we have in place? How can we ensure that we are promoting a greater culture of belonging, and just paying attention to who each kid is and how they might experience the space. So the follow-up to that story about my brother, having to sit out a couple of games, my favorite follow-up to that is the response of his teammates, who were also pretty frustrated and distraught and confused about why their teammate had to sit something out in a way for something that they felt was unfair. And while the outcome wasn't always great, my brother had experienced embarrassment and all sorts of other feelings, he did have the support of his teammates and his coach. And so I think, examples like that, where maybe the actions were small, but the impact was huge, I think is a good reminder for ourselves too. We don't need to fix the world tomorrow, but we can be very intentional in the small things we do.
Really appreciate you sharing all three of those tips. Great information. For our listeners, we are visiting with Deep Sidhu, who is the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Global Online Academy, Raleigh, North Carolina, a career educator, and also a pretty good coach back in the day. We're going to take a quick break, but we're going to come back after we hear from our podcast sponsor, Violet Defense. Violet Defense is dedicated to protecting our world from germs by bringing the power of UV disinfection to everyday spaces. Their patented technology enables them to harness the power of the sun to incorporate ultraviolet light into products and environments like never before. Whether you're ready to implement existing products, or if you'd like to explore researching and developing a custom deployment of their technology for your school, Violet Defense has the solutions and the experience you need. Thanks again to Violet Defense for sponsoring the Educational AD Podcast. Welcome back to our interview with Deep Sidhu, Director of Equity and Inclusion for the Global Online Academy. Deep, with the Olympics just wrapping up, and for our listeners, we're recording this on August 11th. So by the time you're listening to it, it's going to be pretty timely information. With the Olympics just wrapping up, we saw some tremendous performances. And I think we've also seen, thanks to the candor and the openness of a number of athletes, a continued discussion on this idea of mental health. Simone Biles in particular, very candid about some of the challenges that she faced as a world-class athlete. So my question is this: what are some things that, or how can athletic directors and coaches do a better job of finding the balance between, say, an old school approach of you got to be tough, you got to get back in there, versus being aware and sensitive to the challenges that, let's say, a Generation Z student athlete is experiencing? Do you have any advice on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that, well, first of all, the courage that it took for Simone Biles to not only take the action she took, but then to also communicate all that she's experiencing is just profound. And so I think one of the recognitions is just how tough that is as an act, right? So the sort of tough it out statement, I think she has shown how to do that. And I think so sort of that that resilience and that communication is more of an example of toughness. And I wonder if that's one of, I don't know the exact advice, but I wonder if that's one of the ways that we sort of reframe what it means to be a competitive athlete, what it means to be tough and mentally strong. And sometimes that means knowing what the limit is, or how to navigate that limit, or how to sit it out when needed. And I think that the surrounding circumstances are also ones to really pay attention to. I think in athletics, but as well as in academics, we're noticing just the number of increasing pressures on kids, and how that has impacted things like their sleep, things like their motivation, things like their ability to show up and perform at their maximum effort all the time, which they're doing, but at what cost? So I think part of it is just reframing our concept of what it means to be tough, but also being really intentional about the circumstances that surround our athletes these days, and ensuring that we are more focused on supporting them and less focused on forcing them to comply or to perform to meet unreasonable standards.
Guys, I think you hit it right on the head there, is reframing that whole idea. I remember vividly as a student athlete 100 years ago, and as a young coach and not so young coach, this idea of, when you come to practice, practice is practice. And kids don't perform, whether it's the classroom or the athletic fields and courts, in a vacuum. They're bringing their life with them each day. So I think you're absolutely right. Being able to reframe that. Great stuff. Well, Deep, this has been so cool, reconnecting after a couple of years, but we're not done yet. We always like to wrap up with what we call the athletic director's toolbox. Now, you certainly know your way around athletics. I'm going to challenge you right now to send a new athletic director out on their very first job. But I'm only going to let you put 3 things in their toolbox. What 3 items are going to go in your athletic director toolbox?
Well, I think I'm going to cheat here a little bit, and I don't know if I'm going to answer it spot on, but I'm going to quote my dad, and remind this athletic director to make every encounter a good one, to remember that you have the agency to do that. And the 3 ways to do it, I think, are to think about every kid, every team, every coach, and you'll be great.
Well, I don't think it's cheating at all to fall back on the wisdom of the masters. So great tool. Thank you so much. If one of our listeners wanted to reach out to you and pick your brain a little bit, what's the best way that they could get in touch with you?
They can find me on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, my handle is at Deepjyot, DEEPJYOT. And then also you can visit the www.globalonlineacademy.org and find a way to contact me through our organization. And I'd love to chat. Thanks so much.
Deep Sidhu, Global Online Academy, and pretty darn good cross-country coach. Thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Jake.
For listeners, remember the Zoom recordings of these interviews are uploaded to the Educational AD Podcast YouTube channel. We appreciate you listening today. Come back again next time for another episode of the Educational AD Podcast.